Hello and welcome to this exciting program organized in partnership between ETS, Qatar Foundation International, Microsoft, and Salzburg Global Seminar. It is good to see and be with so many friends and colleagues from around the world, if only in gallery view. I know we would much prefer to be together IRL, as they say, in real life. But wherever you are logging on from, the kitchen, the basement, poolside, or by the beach, if you're fortunate, welcome to this evening's session of Beyond the School Gates, developing social and emotional skills outside of formal education. This program is part of a long-running series called Education for Tomorrow's World that Salzburg's Global Seminar has run with ETS for more than a decade. And since 2017, in partnership with Microsoft and Qatar Foundation International. Education for Tomorrow's World has always aimed to inform new approaches to learning, skills, and inclusion for societies that are changing and evolving. Over the last 5 years, we have had particular focus on programs looking at the intersection of education and social justice, and education and whole child development, with a particular focus on social and emotional learning. There were many reasons for this focus on social emotional learning, or SEL as we call it, but high among them is the conviction that social and emotional learning is an absolute, legitimate, and necessary part of the solution to multiple challenges that countries and communities around the world are facing. Social and emotional skills have a role to play in such matters as employability in the economies of today and tomorrow. It has an effect on future mental health and well-being for young people, community cohesion, identity and belonging, improving equity of education outcomes, and meeting global challenges like climate crisis or any other challenges that Sustainable Development Goals are designed to address. We are proud of the work we have been able to do with the Salzburg Global Seminar, Microsoft, and QFI. The programs are achieving real impact, and we hope contributing to the momentum and interest around SEL. One particular highlight has been the establishment of Karenga, the Global Alliance for Social and Emotional Learning and Life Skills, which grew out of Education for Tomorrow's World program in 2018 and 2019, in which ETS has been a proud sponsor and supporter. The OECD report is incredibly well timed to give additional impetus to the SEL movement. We know that one of the historic challenges to social and emotional learning has been around the measurement and assessment. At ETS, that is a challenge that we are confronting every day. School is not the only place in which social and emotional skills can be developed. And a lot of the focus of our time together today will be on programs that happen outside of the classroom. This is the second program organized today. I know the earlier session had some amazing inputs from organizations like using sports and music and community mobilization to help young people develop social and emotional skills. The reference to sports this morning reminded me of my 3 daughters playing soccer or lacrosse as they were growing up, and the impact that that had on their development. Also dancing or travel with friends and many outside activities that they engage, working with people in communities that are less fortunate, and so on. The recording from this morning and for the session this afternoon and evening will be up on the Salzburg Global website in the next few days. The format for today will be that in a minute, Andreas Schleicher, the Director for Education and Skills at OECD, will share some initial findings from the Beyond Academic Learning survey and report. After Andreas's presentation, Dominic Register from the Salzburg Global Seminar will moderate a panel discussion with some superb speakers. Joining Andreas on the panel will be Alia Alzougbi, the head of the International Cultural Learning Organization, Global Learning London, and newly appointed joint CEO of Shubbak, one of Europe's largest festivals of contemporary Arab arts. Justin Edwards will be on the panel as well. He's the Director of Learning Program for Minecraft Education. Maritza Trejo, the Education Program Director at Glasswing International in El Salvador, will be joining Dominic on the panel. After the panel discussion, my friend and colleague at Qatar Foundation International, or QFI, Carine Allaf, will give some closing remarks. All of the speakers will be talking about their work, but also sharing approaches and insights that we hope will be valuable for all of you, wherever you are joining from. Please feel free to post questions and comments in the chat, and Dominic will try to bring them into the discussion. Also, please feel free to share resources that you have found useful in your work around SEL. It now gives me great pleasure to welcome to the virtual stage Andreas Schleicher from OECD. Welcome, Andreas.
Thanks so much, Michael, and thanks also for your plea concerning the relevance of social emotional skills, social emotional learning. I think the question that you raised, can we observe them, can we measure them, though, is very relevant, and that's really where my presentation will focus. And I think the bigger question behind that is, can we, not just, understand the relevance, but are those skills actually learnable? Are they teachable? And I'll be sort of reflecting on those kinds of issues, because of course that, is hugely influential on how amenable they are for public policy. So let me just share my screen with you. You should see it actually now. And I'll start with something that is not directly connected to this, but I believe indirectly. So we live in a world of, some fundamental disconnects. We have the disconnect between the imperative of continuous economic growth, and at the same time, we clearly see the finite resources of our planet. We have the disconnect between the financial economy and the real economy, the disconnect between the wealthy and the poor, the disconnect between our concept of gross domestic product and the well-being of our populations, between technology, what's technologically possible, and what's actually, serving social needs, between the governance of our systems and the voicelessness of people, or the perceived voicelessness of people. And nobody should hold education entirely responsible for this. Absolutely not. I'm not implying that. But clearly the world around us is shaped by the education that we provide, and the world that we will create in the future is very much rooted in the schools that we have today and the other educational opportunities. I think, Michael, you make a very important point that particularly when it comes to social emotional skills, they are learned in many different contexts, and we should start to see them as an ecosystem. When I hear people saying social emotional skills, we should work with extracurricular activities. No, actually, it should be at the heart of tomorrow's curricula. We should look at those things in integration. And I think, the world that we will create tomorrow very much depends on the skills that we shape today. Of course, I know, everybody's attention at this moment is still very much with the kind of pandemic that is fundamentally disrupted the operation of our education systems, but also our thinking about education. And the future will always surprise us. If you think about it, Pandemic was one thing, but surely climate change is going to more fundamentally change our lives. And then you have artificial intelligence putting to a test much more profoundly what makes us human. We know how to educate second-class robots. People are very good to repeat what we've told them. But again, in a world where the kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to test, have also become easy to digitize, to automate. What is it that is going to make us human? And that brings us closer to the kind of social emotional skills. But before I get to this directly, I want to come once more to the kind of challenges. When you survey school leaders, and we did that in our last PISA assessment, to what extent the kind of global challenges are embedded in today's school systems, you get a very positive picture. Now, for example, 9 out of 10 school leaders on average across countries tell you, yeah, climate change and global warming is sort of included in the formal curriculum in some ways. And the same is true for, gender equality or conflicts, poverty, migration, hunger, and so on. So there's a lot that actually schools do to somehow account for the challenges that the world is facing. But when you survey students, and we did that too with our PISA assessment, you get a somewhat different picture. Now, on the one end, you can see that almost 8 out of 10 students say, yeah, looking after the global environment is important to me. This agenda is urgent, it's important to young people. But when you ask them, can you do something about the problems of the world? Or, I think my behavior can impact people in other countries. Those bars get a lot shorter. And that's really the crux of education today. We're very good in transmitting content knowledge to people. But that sense of agency, that's really at the heart of education. That's really, I think, much harder to develop. And that's the last thing that we did in our last PISA assessment. We measured something that we call a student growth mindset. Sort of the self-related beliefs, to what extent you can grow beyond your limits. You can actually, the opposite of that is, I think everything is determined by the intelligence I was born with. And what you can actually see, academic performance and that growth mindset are actually quite closely related. You can see a country like Estonia that is doing extremely well on the PISA assessment is also the country where students report the strongest growth mindset. A country like Indonesia, where students struggle academically, is also, has the majority of students thinking that success is all about the intelligence I was born with. Of course, it's hard to see the causal nature of that relationship, and that can go in many different ways, but you can see the social emotional side here measured by growth mindset, and the academic side are often not so far apart. We often see them as, opposing ends of a spectrum. If I focus more on social emotional learning, I'm going to take time away from mathematics and science. We should look more at the chart like this and look at the integrated, interrelated nature of this. And it's not just about academic skills. We could see that students with a growth mindset, they are more motivated to master difficult tasks. They had a greater sense of self-efficacy. They were less afraid of failure. Again, if you want young people to grow up, as innovative entrepreneurs, they need space to experiment. If they experiment, they need to take risks. If they take risks, they make mistakes. If our education systems do not provide an environment where students can grow with mistakes, maybe our students will not be so creative. So they can see those interconnections. And that's really where we started out with our survey on social emotional skills. We wanted to know more in systematic ways about those kinds of patterns. We looked at aspects like task performance. Think about responsibility, self-control or persistence, self-management, including, your resistance to stress, your sense of optimism. We looked at open-mindedness, curiosity, and creativity, collaboration, social skills, sociability as well. And then we also looked at outcomes that are related to this, like achievement, motivation, and self-efficacy. Now, those were the dimensions that we studied because research has shown that they're highly predictive for labor market and social success. Now, many dimensions that we can measure actually have shown to be related to this. And of course, we also looked at those metrics where we do have reliable measures on this. So that's basically the what question, and on the how. Another angle I should also highlight here is we collected a lot of contextual data from the children themselves at age 10 and 15, from their parents, from their teachers, from their school leaders, because we wanted to understand that ecosystem in which social emotional skills are developed. And here are the systems in which we collected data. You can see we focused on cities rather than countries. It was easier for this study, but it's also cities are often, this is where social issues concentrate. This agenda becomes very prevalent, very something you need to somehow address. And as you can see, we wanted to have a very good coverage of different cultures, different regions, and that's been very successful. You can see every world region somehow represented on this map. I already mentioned we looked at 10-year-olds and 15-year-olds, and we collected about data from 3,000 students in each of the cities that I highlighted. So it's a good and robust data set to make a meaningful kind of analysis. So let's go to the results. Social and emotional skills are not just important in their own right, they're also important predictors of school grades. And that's something that you can see in the data here. The data here shows students with the same demographics, the same cognitive abilities. We've taken the test results out of this equation. And then you can see among 15-year-olds, you find a strong relationship between persistence and better grades in mathematics. When you look across jurisdictions, maybe not so surprising, mathematics is hard. You need to sort of persist in that. Students indicating more trust also did better in mathematics. And the strongest predictor of better math is actually curiosity. And when you look at those three predictors, you can see that it's not just about dedication or parental expectations or pressure of teachers. It's a lot to do with this intrinsic curiosity. Do we, nourish that interest in learning, that love to learn among young people? If we do, it seems, mathematics will follow, if you read a causal relationship in that kind of correlation here. There are also some negative predictors. Sociability, maybe if you chat too much with your neighbors, it's not so great for better math performance. The creativity kind of relationship is a more interesting one. I'm going to come back to this now. But again, what I wanted to show you simply is that social and emotional skills and academic performance are not, orthogonal. They're actually quite closely correlated in many ways. And you can see that it's not just about mathematics. You can see a similar picture when you look at the arts. I show you that here in the shaded bars. Same kind of predictors. And then on a creativity, on the arts, you see a positive relationship. That's, again, perhaps not so surprising. So let's see how that plays out by social background, student demography in greater detail. One of the most striking findings is that 15-year-old students actually tend to show lower social emotional skills than their 10-year-old counterparts. Now, you've seen that in every skill category, in every country, the bars go down. It is not entirely unexpected, I should say. There's actually lots of references in the literature to older students showing lower social emotional skills. Now, maybe older students become more self-aware, more self-critical. Often also they go through a difficult kind of period in entering adulthood, and so there are lots of explanations for this. But if you would find that 15-year-olds do worse in mathematics than 10-year-olds, you would ask yourself, what are we doing wrong in education? For curiosity, for energy, for trust. That's what we see. And even if those are kind of, if the drivers of this are outside education, we should certainly ask, what parents, what schools, what education systems, what out-of-school activities can do to support young people better when they go through this difficult time as they grow into adulthood. That's, I think, something that we should take away. Whatever the source, what can we do to better support children? And obviously, the first step is to see this. I saw it for the first time. I was really puzzled. And I think we need to create awareness that actually social emotional skills are something, yeah, you bring with you, but you can also sort of lose some of that. And actually what's interesting is when you break this down by gender, you see that the drop in social emotional skills is much steeper for girls than for boys when they grow older. You can see the shaded downward bars for girls tend to be quite a bit longer. So let's look at gender difference in a little bit more detail. What you can see here is that 10-year-old girls reported higher levels of skills related to task performance, like, responsibility and achievement motivation. You can see those bars are going up. You can also see empathy, cooperation, tolerance to be more pronounced among girls. But then you have strengths among boys, higher emotional regulation skills, stress resistance, optimism, emotional control, important social skills like assertiveness, energy. You can see the bars going down. It means boys are doing better. And when you look at the picture for 15-year-olds, you can see actually those gaps tend to become larger, the gender gaps in this. Isn't that interesting? In science, our education systems have done very well over the last 20 years to level out gender gaps. The boys and girls on PISA test do pretty much equally well on math and science. But when you look at social emotional skills, you can see quite distinct patterns. They are not the same in every jurisdiction. I should say that some jurisdictions have seen greater gender differences, some much smaller, which also shows you this is not just a psychological thing or something that is natural, but it's something that varies by geography. But we should be aware of this. Social background is the other part of the equation. We can look at this as well, and you can see here socioeconomically advantaged students reported higher social emotional skills than their disadvantaged peers. And that's true in every skill category. And it holds for all of the cities. And when I talk about advantaged schools, it's basically the 25% students with the highest scores on the socioeconomic index and disadvantaged the 25% with the lowest indices. And so that's basically that range. It's not so difficult to understand that pattern. Probably parents from wealthier backgrounds tend to put greater emphasis on social emotional skills. Maybe they tell their children this is really important in life. You need those kinds of things. It's probably also that parents from wealthier backgrounds have just a lot more access to, sports, the arts, things that we know are related positively to social emotional skills. So not surprising, but again, as educators, we should ask ourselves, what can we do to counter that relationship? And what can our communities do to support disadvantaged children better to develop those kinds of skills that we know are so critical for their lives? And again, you can see for the 15-year-olds, that relationship goes all in the same direction. You can, look at this by city, and you can see the patterns vary slightly, but more or less, you can see quite a similar pattern. Social background works pretty universal along these lines. And so there's no city where you could say, here's a place that is actually a lot better in moderating social inequality on these skills. What I already told you that, social emotional skills decline between the ages of 10 and 15. But what you can see here is that this decline is much larger among students from more advantaged backgrounds than among students from more disadvantaged backgrounds. So perhaps, schools are doing something to foster equity, at least in some of the jurisdictions. I want to zoom in this aspect of creativity and curiosity. These are obviously two areas that we typically consider very relevant to innovation, social progress in our communities. The first point I want to actually make is that, creativity is actually quite closely related also to higher, performance on many of the other skill domains. If you look, for example, at curiosity or persistence, many of those domains are actually quite closely interrelated. So we should always look at them as a kind of ecosystem. But now, you know that they were declining. I can show you this by city as well. You can see, for example, the city with the largest drop in creativity between the age of 10 and 15 is Suzhou in China. But you also see, for example, Daegu in Korea or Ottawa in Canada, also there you can see actually 15-year-olds report a lot lower levels of creativity than 10-year-olds. And now you say, well, you know, again, that maybe is self-perception of students, that may be related to, you know, the environment in which they are, and so on. But it's not so simple, because when we surveyed parents and teachers, the bars go pretty much in the same direction. So there seems to be something real going on here. The perceptions of teachers and parents and students actually are more or less aligned. And that tells us, you know, maybe there is something going on here, that, you know, creativity is actually being lost. And maybe it has to do with our way of schooling. And if you are a child in kindergarten, you know, they let you play, they let you question everything that you find around you, experiment with everything that gets into their way, and so on. So we create a lot of room for creative activity. Well, if you go to middle school at the age of 15, you know, we try to make you compliant with certain ways of thinking, certain ways of working. So maybe that's one of the factors that then, you know, limit that space for creativity, because it's quite consistent, at least in most cities, between those different stakeholders. I'm saying the same about the gender pattern. Now you can see that age-related differences in creative self-concept are much more pronounced among girls than for boys. For most cities, you know, the creativity results flip from girls doing better than in the age of 10, here marked in blue, to boys doing better among 15-year-olds. You can see the gender gap, you know, turns around between the age of 10 and 15. And for curiosity, girls often still have an advantage, at least in most of the cities, but their advantage shrinks. So you can really see the kind of trend towards boys. And what's really interesting is that parents and teachers' ratings were quite similar for both genders. So among the learners themselves, the perception changes among the parents, that didn't come out very clearly. Maybe it is a perception issue among boys and girls, but even that perception issue, you know, if we associate higher creativity with males, then probably that's going to have an influence on the occupations people choose, on what they study, and so on. So we should, you know, even to the extent that they are, you know, perceptions, we should take them very serious, because our decisions are very heavily influenced by the perceived reality, even it's not, you know, the observed one. Now, let's look at some of the activity that we often relate to creativity and curiosity, such as sports, here in blue, and the arts, here in orange. And the first thing that strikes you is that actually we give children much more space for sports and the arts when they are 10 than when they are 15. And 15, school keeps them very busy with other things. So that's just the intensity of those kinds of activities. You can see quite a bit among 10-year-olds, so among 15-year-olds. Now, the interesting thing is that at both age groups, you can see them here in the two shades, you can see in every city, students participating in art activities report higher levels of creativity, that's the left side of the chart, and higher levels of curiosity on the right side. And again, it's consistent across jurisdictions. So sports and the arts seem to be correlated with higher levels of creativity, and the same is true, and even more so than the arts. Actually, here you see just the arts. The next chart is the sport. You can see the bars get a little bit shorter, but you can see the same pattern. So again, you know, often we think that arts and sports take time away from things like math and science, but they seem to add something when it comes to social emotional skills. And remember how much it predicted curiosity was also for better mathematics performance. Now, there is, you know, some scope for reverse causality and lots of other things in here. But again, I think these correlations point us to look harder at those kinds of questions. Let me move on to an aspect that gets sort of a little bit beyond that space of social emotional skills, and that's the social relations in school. What our survey shows is that students' sense of fitting in with school and the quality of student-teacher relations are consistently and positively related to social emotional skills. First of all, you know, the majority of students say they feel they belong at school. Now, that's true for both age groups. But we should also look at the share of students where that is not the case. You can see sort of on most of the questions, roughly a quarter of students, feel a bit like an outsider. They don't make friends easily. They feel lonely and so on. So again, the overall picture looks great, the average, but then you look a little bit at the distribution, and it's something that should concern us. Why? Because again, students who feel they belong at school show much higher social emotional skills across all of the skill categories for which we have data. You can really see how that sense of belonging is something that actually predicts better social emotional skills. It could also be that students with better social emotional skills just feel a greater sense of belonging, but the two somehow belong together. That's really the point that I want to make here. The other side of the spectrum, of course, is bullying. Yeah, something the survey looks at as well. We look at this at the age of 15, and you can see psychological bullying there is more prevalent among the 15-year-olds, more so among boys than among girls. But the numbers are not dramatic. You might think they're much larger when you move to 10-year-olds. When you look at the younger children, you can see the incidence of bullying is much higher, and particularly so among boys. Now, you will not be surprised that bullying is a negative predictor for social emotional skills. Sense of belonging was a positive predictor. Bullying is a negative predictor for virtually every kind of skill category. Not so difficult to understand. We, on a more positive note, you can see in this chart that most students report actually quite good relationships with their teachers. It's a little bit less pronounced for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. It could be that disadvantaged students just have a tough life, so it's harder for them to establish a relationship with their teachers. It could be that disadvantaged schools end up in schools where teachers don't invest as much in those relationships. We do not know, but you can see there's a gap. And that gap is quite consistent across jurisdictions now. And again, the quality of student-teacher relationships is a very strong predictor for the social emotional skills across every skill category now. And that's important, learning is never a transactional experience. It's always a social, relational experience. And the quality of relations actually is something that predicts, virtually every of the social emotional skill categories that we have measured. Finally, I want to just highlight the aspect of student well-being more generally. We ask students how satisfied they are with their lives, and overall you can see, yeah, students in general are satisfied with their lives, more so at the age of 10 than at the age of 15. Now that will be familiar to you. That's the overall pattern that we see. There's also quite some variability across jurisdictions. Students in Manizales in Colombia seem more satisfied with their lives than students in Ottawa, for example. Now, there's some variability, but overall, I think the pattern is here. And again, in each of the participating cities, students are more optimistic, tend to be more satisfied with their lives. So there are some predictors that work quite consistently on the social emotional skills side. The World Health Organization has an interesting metric to assess the psychological well-being of students, which we use here for 10-year-olds. And again, you can see a generally positive picture. Also, again, consistently lower results for girls than for boys, and much lower results when you move from 15-year-olds to 10-year-olds. Once again, also more pronounced than for girls than for boys. And again, also that psychological well-being is a very important predictor for outcomes. You can see that students' social emotional skills are quite closely related to their students' psychological well-being, and that's driven after accounting for social background and gender. And that's particularly the case. You can see that here for stress resistance, for optimism, for energy. So being optimistic is consistently related to both a higher level of life satisfaction and to psychological well-being, once again, across cities. Very last point, Anxiety, I know that's a big concern for many, anxiety with tests, anxiety with schooling, particularly, now after the pandemic, many people talk about this. And what you can see here, first of all, is more anxiety among 15-year-olds than among 10-year-olds. Now, that could be explained by, more academic pressures and things like this. Also among girls, among boys. No? Isn't that interesting? Girls are generally better prepared for tests, at least that's what they say. They usually do better on tests at age 15, particularly when you look to language, and still they tend to feel greater levels of anxiety, or maybe because of that. And you can see that test anxiety and well-being are quite closely related. If you look at this for girls here, you can see jurisdictions where test anxiety is greater tend to feel lower levels of well-being, and you can see a similar pattern for boys, even though overall anxiety levels are lower. So there seems to be a consistent pattern across countries. Now, one conclusion you might draw from this is, oh well, let's just make it easier for students. Let's make the test easier. Let's make less pressure, and so on. But that's actually not the answer to this. In fact, we do not see any relationship between, and that's results from our PISA assessment, between the prevalence of tests in a country and the anxiety levels of students. Now, actually, the relationship is all mediated through perceived support from students. So you can have, actually, you can see here on the chart, cities like Suzhou or Daegu, they're tough on students, they're very kind of demanding on students, high expectations from parents, teachers. But well-being levels are actually quite high because students in those systems actually feel quite well supported by their teachers. And that brings me to the last slide. When you look at the learning environment, school climate, we don't see much of a relationship, but you can see that for 10-year-olds, a competitive school climate, high expectations from parents and teachers are actually strongly related to greater psychological well-being. Isn't that interesting? Many people associate, more competitive environment in school, maybe to a greater level of, to lower well-being, but actually the opposite is the case. A competitive school climate, high expectations from parents and teachers are actually positively related to psychological well-being. The pattern is less pronounced for 15-year-olds, but for both age groups, you can see also that competition and expectations are also a predictor of greater test anxiety. And there you can see how the two come together as well. So that's really all I wanted to show you. What you can see clearly is that education systems should strive for a more holistic appreciation of different knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values. We should no longer see cognitive skills and social emotional skills as opposing ends on a spectrum that take time away from each other. They're actually mutually strong predictors for themselves. When students perceive that they are treated in a fair way, when the school and its staff help students to develop a sense of belonging, when there are positive relationships, generally you can see more positive climate, better social emotional skills, which suggests that actually, teachers in schools can make a difference. In the past, some people argued that we are talking about psychological personality traits, things that we cannot, change. But actually, nowadays, we can see, and these data actually are providing interesting confirmation, the variation by geography, by school, and so on, provides interesting confirmation that we do talk about skills that can be learned. And as you can see, learning environments also make a difference for them. Thank you very much.
Andreas, thank you ever so much for sharing all of that. This is the second time today that I've heard you give that presentation, and I feel like I've taken a completely different set of conclusions away from it. It's such a fantastically rich presentation. In anticipation of questions and comments coming up, then we will be able to make Andreas's presentation available to everyone who's joined this webinar. It now gives me enormous pleasure to welcome our other panelists to the virtual stage. So Alia, Justin, and Maritza, if you wouldn't mind coming on camera. Alia Alzougbi is the head of the International Cultural Learning Organization, Global Learning London, and is also the newly appointed joint CEO of Shubbak, Justin Edwards is Director of Learning Programs for Minecraft Education. Maritza Trejo is the Education Programs Director at Glasswing International based in El Salvador. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to ask each of them an opening question, and they'll have sort of 3 to 4 minutes to respond to that, to answer the question and introduce themselves and their work. And we'll then come back to Andreas for any connections or comments that he wishes to make with the based on what the panelists have said in the OECD study, and we'll then move in to a conversation between the 5 of us. And as Michael said at the beginning, I'll do my best to bring in as many of your questions and comments as possible. So please feel free to continue posting them in the chat. But Alia, if we could start with you first, please. So you're with us representing 2 really interesting organizations. From what I've read, one of the things that connects both of them is the approach that you take to creating active citizenship opportunities that help young people develop their social and emotional skills. And we would love to learn more about this and about your work, please.
Absolutely, Dominic. And my head is still buzzing from Andreas's presentation. So forgive me if I'm not entirely together with the response. I'll try to stick to the 3 to 4 minutes, given that I'm talking about 2 organizations. The first, Global Learning London, is an organization that works with schools in the community to cultivate optimism and action for a more just and sustainable world, and sees well-being and social emotional learning as deeply connected to the well-being of the earth and the well-being of each other. So our relationships to one another and our relationships with the earth. And therefore the work that we do is very much young people led. We basically throw a seed and see what's happening and then move out of the way. And we find that young people are incredibly responsive, responsible, and really able to lead on all sorts of creative ideas when it comes to addressing issues in their local community while taking a global perspective on things. So just to give a quick example, we now have a project called Story Resilience, which combines the concept of storytelling with resilience, that looks at the pandemic and turns this notion of deficit on migrant communities. So a lot of the stories we were hearing, certainly in the UK, about communities of color was, somehow the virus is affecting them more, they must be weaker, there must be something, somehow less prone to survival among them. And we take all of that and we swap it around by sending young people out into the community, equipping them with research methodologies, finding out what is going on, what is the perspective of our communities, where is the resilience that we're not hearing in the mainstream media, and then taking these stories and having creative responses to them on the stage. And then with Shubbak, Shubbak is a biennial festival, but also an organization that works to combat misrepresentation or lack of representation of Arab communities across the world, although we're based in London, but we work nationally and internationally. And one of our flagship projects is the Young Shubbak project. And I really heard Andreas when he spoke about uncertainty, and you said that the future will continue to surprise us. So what's interesting about that project is when it started 3 years ago, we thought it would go on a certain trajectory. And when we gave the leadership and the direction to the young people and made it more of an iterative process, it became far bolder and far more beautiful than we could have ever imagined, really.
It's really interesting, Alia, and I know there's lots that we'll be able to come back to in that. But the sort of when you create opportunities for young people to get more involved in their communities, or start to design their own sense of purpose, then it does reinforce a lot of the social and emotional skills development. And the correlation with one of Andreas's earlier slides about the relationship between agency and belonging, I think, is really strong here. So lots for us to return to, and thank you very much for covering 2 organizations in the time. Justin, I'd love to bring you in now, please. Now, you're head of learning at Minecraft. The connection between video games and social and emotional skills development isn't immediately obvious to many people, I imagine. I know many parents see gaming as a distraction from school, so we'd love to get your take on this and hear evidence that you might have to the contrary, please.
Yeah, thanks, Dominic. So, initially it can seem a little strange how can a video game like Minecraft address social and emotional skills. And for many people listening in on this call, maybe they've played Minecraft, or maybe they know somebody who has played Minecraft, or they have somebody at home who plays Minecraft. And as a game, it has a reach monthly to 140 million players, and millions of players play the game for educational purposes in that time as well. And with that reach of that channel comes a huge responsibility to address the kind of key questions that learners are trying to explore around resilience, around mindset, around diversity, inclusion, around sustainability and climate. And so we have very much taken a view of building content inside the game that starts to explore and build understanding of these topics through play. So we purposely try and bring fun, we try and bring immersion, we try and bring challenge and an element of risk from a gameplay point of view to these topics to help learners explore deeply the themes. And to give you two examples, we launched a game over a year ago now called Mindful Night. And through this game, children play smaller games inside a world to explore the topics of mindfulness. And as they complete tasks, which are mindful tasks and self-awareness tasks, they actually increase their score until ultimately they become a mindful night. And it's a single player game that most children spend between 30 minutes and an hour playing as individuals or in groups in a classroom with a teacher supporting that. And what we found from games like this, and the feedback particularly from teachers and educators around the world, and it is in 109 countries, from educators around the world, is how immersive it becomes. And it isn't just about the in-game experience where the learners are learning that content. They come out of game and are discussing the topics that were raised inside the game and exploring the topics further and developing their understanding of those topics. We've also expanded recently into climate and sustainability education. And it would be very easy to go in and talk about the effects of global warming and some of the challenges that we face as a society. But what we wanted to do was, one, encourage creativity, problem solving and artistry in this area. So building on those skills so that we're asking young people to think about the solutions to the challenges we face, but also to build empathy. So one of the games that we've built out explores deforestation, not just from the impact of nature, but actually the impact of the workers who are involved in deforestation and how they can seek other employment or the changes that they face. So bringing about cultural empathy and understanding the changes that they face, again, through game-based learning. And you'd think that these games are suitable for young children because Minecraft is often, but actually the average game player is 24 years old. So it's reaching out to a whole breadth of community right the way throughout the education spectrum, not just in primary or post-primary, secondary, but actually going through to higher education as well. And we've seen recently, certainly since countries have started to emerge from the pandemic situation and a return to classroom, quite a shift from the content that we provide in STEM to the content that we provide positively to the content we provide in social and emotional learning. And we're finding that learners aren't just downloading this in the classroom, they're downloading it at home. So the deforestation world I talked to you about earlier was launched at the end of August, and 1 million children have downloaded that already to try and explore that topic. So there's a thirst and a hunger for this content, particularly from young people, not just from educators.
Are you finding that the games that have a sort of social purpose attached to them, like the kind of one addressing deforestation, are gaining more traction with young people, or is it a sort of evenly distributed across the games, which are more for pleasure?
They are gaining more traction. What seems to happen is that the pleasure games have a kind of high initial interaction, whereas the social and emotional games have a longer interaction. Learners return to the content, learners play the content more than once, maybe trying to explore a theme or trying to re-answer a question that they have floating around these topics. Particularly on the theme of climate, we've certainly found that. And like I said before, we're finding a shift in kind of curriculum content, whereas before computer science or STEM, chemistry, for example, would be now popular. We're actually finding a shift more to this social, emotional, and a sustained play of that.
Brilliant, thank you. And there's an interesting climate connection, I know, with some of Alia's work as well. I thought the reference to empathy is really interesting as well, in the light of Forbes magazine last week had a list of the top 10 leadership skills or something like that, and they ranked empathy as the most important leadership skill for the 21st century, at this point in the 21st century, I think. So again, lots for us to return to there, and thank you for your opening remarks. Maritza, I have to bring you in now, please. So a lot of Glasswing's programs grew out of violence prevention initiatives, and you use a volunteer-led, community-based approach. They've been hugely successful in El Salvador and across Central America. So we'd love to hear more about how social and emotional learning, social and emotional skills development fits into the program portfolio, please.
Hi, yes, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting us. It's truly a pleasure to be here. And like Alia mentioned, my brain was just exploding with all the interesting connections from the presentation. Yes, El Salvador and like most of the other countries where we work, Glasswing in Central America, we've had a history of wars and violence. I'm sure you're familiar with the Northern Triangle and how for the past years, social, specifically gang violence, has affected our communities. I do believe, and we believe in Glasswing, that many of the problems related to violence are related specifically to lack of empathy that you just mentioned, lack of social cohesion, lack of perspective taking, compassion, and other social emotional skills. And that's why the core of our work in the schools and even the work that we do with the hospitals, even the work that we do with the police in the communities, have a lot to do with promoting social emotional skills, because in general, and the research shows it, right? People who have these skills also tend to be engage less in violent actions or negative interactions with other people. So that's been the core of our programs, and for us, through our after-school programs, which you mentioned, are led by volunteers, and the volunteers play a huge critical role because they become positive role models, that come to the schools, and the after-school setting. I think, like you mentioned before, it plays an important role too in promoting social emotional skills, because not only, and this opens a lot of debate, but one of the reasons I love working in the after-school settings is because we don't have that anxiety or those, that comes with grading and kids being promoted to different grades because of their performance. It's very structured, but it's also in a way that kids are allowed to make mistakes and they learn as we play. We offer in our after-school program a different array of activities based on the students' interests that can range from sports, art, music, dance, photography, science, debate. We have about 12 to 15 clubs in each of the schools, and students can choose freely whichever club they want to participate. And if 3 months into the program, they decide they don't want to be in sports anymore and they want to try debate, we make it very flexible, still in a structured way, so that students can explore this interest. And one of the interesting things that was mentioned in the presentation, it really just blew my mind. And I remember talking to you about this yesterday, Dominic. It's how in our evaluation of our program that was done 4 or 5 years ago by the World Bank, one of the interesting findings was that kids who participated in our after-school program improved their grades in math and science, regardless of the club. And I couldn't understand why, you know, and I asked the researchers, I mean, I can understand why the kids in the discovery clubs that have to do with science improve their grades in math and science, but kids in our debate class or our math or our sports clubs, how do they also improve their grades in math and science? And now it makes sense after hearing Andreas, you know, explanation about how, you know, all these after school activities improve their creativity, improve their curiosity, and that may be the connection to why they improve also their tests in math and science. You know, and I think, you know, we've been very intentional in a lot of our work, especially now, because as a result of the pandemic, we are trying to become more intentional how to include and more explicit content about teaching these skills, because in the past, you know, we sort of expected through the training that we do of teachers and volunteers that they model these skills like empathy, teamwork, you know, kindness. But now we're working in integrating these into our curriculum so that they're more explicit. We use mindfulness, we use morning circles in our after school programs so that students, you know, open up and learn how to identify and express their emotions. And again, that's something that we also see having an effect, not only the way students relate to each other, but how they also start relating better with their teachers and also with their families at home. You know, our program, the core or the main purpose of our program, and we always talk about, you know, building communities and making sure the schools are safe environments for the children and for the community as a whole. And we hope, you know, that through these programs, we help prevent the kind of violence, you know, and conflict that has affected our communities for so many years. Thank you.
Thanks, Maritza. I think that just, I mean, there's so much that we could come back to from what you just said, but the point about emotional literacy is really interesting, I think. And, you know, when you're creating environments that really encourage the development of emotional literacy, it has all sorts of other benefits in terms of interaction and relationships. I don't know, Andreas, if I can't remember now if there's anything in the study about emotional literacy specifically, whether that was something that you surveyed.
You know, I think when we look at the quality of social relations, I think that aspect comes in. But I do think, you know, many of the skills that we measure relate to people's emotions, and whether you call it literacy or not, it is a very important outcome that we should, you know, put on par with the literacies that we develop in other fields. That's really, I think, the point of using a phrase like this or a term like this, that we should not consider them as a kind of byproduct or personality trait. I'm actually quite fascinated by the examples that, you know, Alia and Maritza present here, that actually it's not rocket science to develop those skills. If you think about it, it may actually be a lot harder to teach people mathematics and a lot less successful than to teach them the kind of social emotional skills that will make them very successful in their life. Because one thing that we should, you know, and you know, Maritza, you talk about after school activities. I think this is where the problem starts. You know, if you come from a wealthy background, you're going to get to a school that actually, you know, the main differentiator of privileged schools is often not on, you know, 3 points more on math and science, but it's precisely on character, on social emotional outcomes. And that's where they make that difference. And that's what you miss out if you come from a disadvantaged background. So if we push it always to the afternoon or the out of school, actually it may, you know, increase those disparities. We should, you know, consider the disciplines in school also as very good kind of enablers of social emotional skills. When you teach sports, don't ask yourself, you know, just whether your students become more athletic, but what do you contribute to helping people, to young children, to get more responsibility for themselves, to take responsibility for others, to develop courage, leadership, and so on. When you teach, you know, mathematics, what do you contribute to strengthening curiosity and creativity? And I think that understanding for me is missing today. We say, okay, in the morning we do the school part, and then in the afternoon we do for some kids those additions. And but I'm really fascinated. It's not rocket science and so on. The points from Justin also I found really interesting, and I'm in two minds about it. You know, our PISA results show that actually intensive use of video games tends to be negatively related to student well-being, to their life satisfaction, to psychological aspects as well. But, you know, probably it's a matter of how those tools are used, how they are designed, how they are developed, how they're deployed. And again, I think making those things more a deliberate effort of the education ecosystem rather than just, you know, tagging them onto something, I think is really our task.
Presumably the nature of the video game has a specific impact there that, I mean, Justin can speak much more eloquently and knowledgeably to this, but not all video games are constructed around the same ethos, are they?
No, I think, you know, as in any entertainment business, we take from an entertainment perspective, yes, there's a broad range, but it is, and we've proven it, possible. It is possible to build in educational intent into games that engage. And I think that educational intent can come in the form of some of these future-ready skills, however you want to put it, the skills that are needed by employers, the creativity, also the resilience, but also the empathy, as we talked about earlier, are key within inside that. And to give an example of another game that we've been working with that's made a big difference, we've looked at quandaries, ethical decisions, where there is no right outcome with inside gameplay, but actually the outcome is better understanding of the information, the data, and the decision making from a child's perspective. And it's fascinating to watch young people play these games time and time again, when the outcome will likely be failure, because there is no necessary right outcome. There's no win point. The win point is how you reflect on that. So it is possible to pivot games towards deep understanding of these things. To go back to, if I can pick up just a moment, Dominic, to go back to Andreas' point about after school, I think one of the things we're seeing, particularly from socially excluded children, is that they're willing to engage through esports. So the idea of competitive play through gameplay online. And another facet of angling games in that space is, can you make them academic esports or scholastic esports? So actually the challenge, the competitive challenge, is around numeracy or literacy, in a way that the skills that they require are being met, but they are implicit with inside the gameplay, the competitive gameplay. And the accessibility to things like mobile devices, or the accessibility to low market end devices, as we refer to them around the globe, opens that potential up for those children who maybe wouldn't be able to access a club in a normal scenario, but maybe could access it remotely through their device and still engage. So, and we have to play a very careful role here, because, you know, esports could take us down the space of just playing computer games for the sake of it, rather than this idea of, can we introduce knowledge and understanding that's beneficial for longer term social skills, but also academic skills.
Alia, I wonder if we could come back to something you said that connects with what Justin was just talking about, I think, and the kind of, when you were talking about some of the work with Global Learning London and sending young people out into the communities to challenge media narratives that display prejudice towards different communities, and the sort of the critical thinking component of that, I think, is something that connects with some of what Justin was talking about as well. And would love to, you know, hear a bit more about how you support young people navigate what must be, you know, potentially very complex and challenging social situations.
Yeah, and again, my head's spinning with what Justin's saying as well, you know, the importance of playfulness as a skill, you know, for us to be able to navigate our way through the world, through the complexities that are coming up, through when there are no right answers. so yes, so my head is spinning with what Justin's saying. What I'm trying to say is, can we have this seminar for 5 hours, please? But I realize we have to end soon. But so in response to your question there, Dominic, and just reflecting on this idea of young people and the crisis of well-being and anxiety that Andreas was speaking about. And, you know, we know that the WHO has proclaimed that the crisis of our times is mental well-being, and young people are certainly suffering incredibly when it comes to just figuring out their place in the world, their purpose in the world. What am I even here for? And it goes back to, again, Andreas's point on the purpose of education. You know, what is the purpose of education? Just going back to that central question, the fact that, you know, Maritza and I, through our work, and Justin, we're having to kind of go outside the school system to start exploring these issues, to find these connections, to mine what's already in us. You know, the very interesting research coming out today that actually intrinsically, and it's an argument, and as Maritza says, this is open for debate, but those of us who have read Rutger Bregman's Humankind, that actually we are wired to be socially and emotionally intelligent. And there's something about the way that our society is set up now that's trumping that instinct of ours to really be connected with each other, to read each other well, to have a sixth sense, to feel each other, and not just to, you know, to get further, you know, further ahead and leave everyone behind. So that's interesting. Working with young people in communities, certainly young people who feel connected from their own histories, disconnected from their own histories. So we particularly work with migrant communities in London. London is very much a city of migrant communities, although I hesitate to use the word migrant, because at what point do you stop being a migrant? I mean, we still use the term migrant for third and fourth generation Londoners. So, you know, it is absolutely that craving for connection and for being able to tell your own story when you're hearing so much, when these young people are hearing so much about who they are from, as I say, a deficit perspective. That ability to take ownership over the narrative, their own narrative. And then going back to also, you know, Justin's point on technology and how it's helping, then going on to using technology to proliferate a story that's actually quite contrary to what we're hearing out there in that mainstream media. And to you know, to have the hope that actually we can turn things around, to have the hope that that actually the stories I'm being told about my possibility of achievement, the limitations of my aspirations, where my people have come from, that actually I can turn that around. There's another way of seeing where we come from and how we find that information and then proliferate it ourselves. So that sense of ownership also over the narrative and over their own lives. So that trajectory of who I can become, the growth mindset that Andreas was speaking about, that, you know, kind of really equipping young people. And it's almost like we don't even need to think about it too much. You know, it's once we're out there in the field and we're saying, you can drive this, it's incredible what comes out of it. And what the young people keep coming back to every time we evaluate is the sense of belonging and connection that happens as a result of being actively engaged in solving issues around environmental and social justice as they are being expressed by their communities and not necessarily as they're coming through sort of mainstream channels.
It's a good, I think, connection there. And it's all about, you know, when you're able to, if young people feel that society has low expectations of them because that's a dominant narrative, then through organizations like yours, you're able to raise those expectations. And, you know, I think one of the really most interesting things in Andreas's presentation was that the point about high expectations are actually good for psychological well-being, and that, you know, young people respond very well to that. You know, Andreas, if there's anything you'd like to add on that point or come into the conversation.
No, I agree with this. I really think it's the connections that we build and the social relationships in school that actually the myth that, it's not the academic pressure, it's the lack of, connections that young people perceive. And I think there's so much that schools can actually do. School is such a great place. It's actually your first place where you meet diversity in your society. That's where you meet people who come from different traditions, from different cultures, who represent different ways of thinking. We just should, use that space more deliberately in a way. I think that's where I think school could become such a different place. Also, school is usually good in keeping students inside and the rest of the world outside. And I do think the more connections we can build between school and other learning spaces, again, not by, making them extracurricular, but building deliberate kind of connections, I think the more successful we will be to provide learning environments that actually enhance that kind of whole student, whole child development.
In amongst all of the kind of chaos and trauma that the pandemic has wrought across communities and for education, there's also been that massive expansion of where learning can happen and where learning is possible. So if we think about potentially positive legacies out of the last 18 months, that could be achieved.
Yeah, I think this pandemic has illustrated this in a very powerful way. If you had learned how to learn as a student, if you had access to great learning environments, if you had people around you who were good mentors, good coaches, good facilitators, you could actually survive pretty well when schools are closed. But if you used to be spoon-fed by your teachers, where you were just a passive consumer of educational content, you didn't have those supportive ecosystems around you, you were left very badly behind. I think this is really what this pandemic has reinforced, is that this kind of commodification that we have seen in education, that students become consumers and teachers become service providers and parents, clients. I think that has created that distance that we now pay for in a moment when we need school to become a whole of society enterprise. And I think that's, for me, certainly a very big lesson. Same for the teachers. If you are nothing but a great instructor, knowledge transmission, you can be replaced by technology. There's actually very little unique value that you add. If you are a great mentor, a great, facilitator, you have a good relationship with your students, your students, this is your moment in the pandemic. So
there was really interesting data last year that RAND published in the US that was looking at schools that the conclusion of the survey was that schools that had a strong culture of teacher collaboration pre-pandemic were consistently more successful at supporting student and teacher well-being and academic attainment during periods of school shutdown. I think that's a kind of really interesting cultural ethos or factor that could be replicated and introduced to almost every school around the world. I mean, Maritza, a lot of Glasswing's work, it uses the infrastructure of school, doesn't it? And the kind of physical infrastructure. So do you work closely with teachers on the volunteer programs, and are they very involved in what you do outside of the school day, as it were, the school hours?
Yes, and I wanna add that we also agreed that ideally we wish all of these would just be integrated and not separated as after school programs. I mean, there are its benefits. I see that as an after school program, but this is partly because of just the way education system is right now. We have sort of a privileged position that we can sort of dig deeper into the lives of the students and the communities, and a lot of it has to do with just the constraints that as a context, as countries we have. Our education systems are lack a lot of funding, right? So a lot of our schools, there's only the principal and the teachers. That's it. There's no nurse, there's no psychologist, there's none of that. So a lot of our teachers, even in a lot of our countries, there's the 2-shift system. So some group of students will go in the morning from 6 a.m. to noon, and then they go home, and then at 1 p.m. another shift of students comes in, because we just don't have enough schools for all of the students, right? So that also puts more pressure on the teachers to focus. Although I do agree that there are simple things, you know, even just including morning circles with the students, being more flexible and not using punitive measures to address discipline will change definitely the environment. And as the program, you know, when we go into a school, we're there for the long term. You know, we always see teachers and we work together with the teachers, with the communities. And we hope that over the time, which, you know, it's difficult and it's definitely a long process, to influence also the way teachers are used to interacting with the teacher, I mean, with the students, or even with the community itself, right? So, so we do that, but it's hard. It's difficult. A lot of the teachers, when we ask them, you know, can you be part of the program and volunteer, they're very honest and they say, I support you. I send my students to your clubs, but at noon I have to go teach at another school, right? So I can't really be part of the program. And Saturdays, when we also have our out of school programs, you know, they say Saturday is the only day I get to spend with my family, so I can't really stay, you know, and participate in the program. So I think, you know, in a way, we all have to see education as being a responsibility for everyone, not just the teachers. Like me, as you know, when I started Glasswing, I started as a volunteer coaching a basketball club in one of our public schools. And we mobilized just in El Salvador about 1,000 volunteers throughout the country that, you know, they volunteer 2 hours a week to work with the students. And, you know, the clubs, whatever interest the students have, they just become an excuse for us to really work on these social emotional skills. And in the pandemic, now that it was mentioned, you know, it was really difficult because a lot of our teachers have already over 20, 30 years in service. A lot of our teachers don't have computers at home. We weren't ready as a country to even provide the minimum equipment to teachers, right? So they can work with the students throughout these years. And I was speaking to one of our school principals a couple of days ago, and she was really concerned because she told me that the kids who are now in second grade, this is the second grade of students. This is the first year they're in the school building. And she said the kids were really surprised, but also seem a little bit scared because for the past 2 years, they've been at school at home and they haven't had an physical interaction with teachers or with other students. And it makes us wonder, you know, as a after school program or as a support system, you know, to the schools, to the regular school system, how we need to step in, right? Ideally, we want all of this to be integrated, to have a holistic approach to education. I don't know when that's going to happen. Hopefully, like you mentioned, because of the pandemic now, there's more emphasis put on making explicit, you know, spaces for social emotional learning, spaces for building connection. But in the meantime, you know, we need to prioritize and we need to take advantage of any opportunity, any space. We focus on the schools, but we also, before the schools opened in El Salvador, we were already also looking for alternative places in the communities, like churches or community houses, you know, that they're part of the community, to bring the students in, because we knew that they were needing that connection. They wanted to see their peers. They wanted to interact with others. They were tired of being behind a phone screen, because that's another issue in our countries. Maybe 1 out of 10 students, or even less, maybe it's 1 out of 30 students have access to a computer. Most of them use a phone to connect, you know, and they don't have internet connection all the time. They need, so as Glasswing, throughout these 2 years, we've been also supporting with data access, because it's just the reality. So I think it's great, you know, that some schools are starting to open up and we're able to go back to the schools and work with the teachers. And we'll definitely, you know, that's something that we will continue to focus on, how we can integrate practices into the entire system and not just our after school program.
Loved what you said about responsibility. Maritza, reminded me of that fantastic quote from Hannah Arendt about education being the point at which you decide if you love the world enough to take responsibility for it, and that idea of it being a collective endeavor. One of the things which is sort of really interesting connection across all of your work is the way in which you're working with young people to create a particular environment that allows them to, either, Maritza, in your case, it's about violence prevention. Alia, in your case, it's about, helping them challenge negative stereotypes in the media around that. Justin, it's a virtual environment, a virtual world. And how do you work with students when real world doesn't conform with the environment that you helped create for them? So do you have specific resilience development programs, for example? How do you help them maintain optimism and hope? Maybe Alia, you could come in first on that.
It's as if we're on the same wavelength, because Maritza was speaking, and I really heard you, Maritza, when you were talking about what Andreas also raised in his presentation about the very real socioeconomic inequality that's become so starkly exposed. It's always been there, just became more starkly exposed during the pandemic, and the structures within which we are working. So we can change we can build social and emotional resilience in the individual, but there are these incredibly unequal and unjust structures within which we are operating. And going back to this idea also of the tension between we must be productive and we must grow and we must make more money, and the fact that we have limited resources as human beings and as the earth. So yes, this question around how do you make space for, and I'm going to call it the fury that or the outrage that comes about when you recognize that the world is very unjust and the earth is being treated unjustly as well. How do you make space for that? And I think a lot of it is building that optimism. So just to give you a technique that we are always aware of using, research has shown that, just to give an example, I'll start with an example actually. If you start with, say, a positive image of people planting trees, and then run some kind of a session or interaction or field work or play, around deforestation, climate change, children and young people will be quite active, will find solutions to this issue. If you run the same exact scheme, whether it's a lesson plan or a play or a field work, whatever it is, but you start with an image of trees that are chopped down, these same young people will end up feeling dispirited, not quite knowing what to do, not quite knowing where to go. So the idea of starting with a solution and a positive, doing the intervention, doing the work, whether it's over 6 months or over 3 years, the result of that will be building a kind of yes, a hope and a resilience for what could be possible. So this is one technique that we're always conscious of working with, whether it's around our climate work. We do a lot of work around racial justice as well, and any work around inclusion too.
Justin, you've unmuted with intent. So
yeah. So I think continuing that theme, I think one of the elements that we're able to use is a safe place to fail. So we create games that allow learners to experience failure, either in competition with each other at quite a simple level, or actually through interactions of what happens in the game. So if you take our climate work at the moment, you actually interact with the game, and then it shows you the future. And it shows you the future that you've created by your interactions at that point in time. Now, it's not to understand the solutions to climate, that is one of the outcomes, but it actually gets learners asking the question, why? why did I fail? Where did I go wrong? And allows particularly educators, because we always talk about in-game and out-of-game experience, particularly educators working with those young people, to nurture those questions and nurture the answers as they start to explore that point of failure. So to come back to your point, your question, Dominic, about building resilience is built out of that, but computer games allow that. Computer games failure does no harm. It allows us to explore the rationale and reasons and develop that out. One of the other areas we're looking at, and it relates back to Alia's point, is what I would term active citizenship. So how can I be part of a community inside a game and take a responsible role inside that game? And what do my contributions to the community and the group of citizens in that game with me make? And what lessons can I take from ineffective decisions or incorrect decisions? And how can I engage with the people inside the game? And because we're inside a game, we drop all the other barriers. We drop other identities. We've seen games recently where children from different backgrounds who would not necessarily interact with each other school to school actually come together in game to look at these kind of gameplays to build out solutions. So we focus on specific topics, which are shared topics, and it's the shared topic of achieving inside a game.
Hi. I also want to add, that it's Andrea mentioned a couple of times also the sense of belongingness, and I think that through the after school clubs, or even I know that kids who, because some of my students, they're very into these gaming communities, right, and they feel part of that gaming community, and I really don't understand it because I've never been part of one, but I can see the passion and just how excited they get about this. But going back to the sense of belongingness and how through our programs, having also a safe space where they also are, they feel supportive, they have their peers, but there's also a positive role adult model who believes in them. And that also builds that resilience, to have those healthy and nurturing relationships. And for our program to make concrete opportunities for students to develop that sense of agency where they can, not only become change agents for themselves, but also for their communities. And one of the things that we've been trying to do with our program specifically is that as students grow older, and they've been part of our programs for many years, they can always come back and volunteer and become that positive role model for the students. And I want to mention very quickly something that we did a couple of years ago. We did this survey with the students where we've had several focus group with students in Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador, where we wanted to explore what, in their context, what were the character strengths that they considered to be the most valuable to them? Because at that point we were exploring, if we wanted to introduce some character strengths-based curriculum into our program. But we noticed that a lot of the character strength curriculums available, didn't consider the context of our students. They were created, in more economically advanced countries. So we came to the students and we asked them, we had different scenarios and we looked at we used the is it Seinfeld, I can send more the information later. I just forgot that part right now. But anyways, so there's about 21 different character strengths, and we went to different scenarios with the students. And one of the interesting findings from these survey was that for students, hope was a very important character strength, which we didn't find in any of the curriculums available in the other countries. And it makes sense, hearing what Alia was mentioning in our context, that really makes a lot of difference. And through our programs, and especially through the work that our volunteers that become positive role models for our students do, I think that's one of our main goals, to instill hope, right? That we know it's difficult. The world sucks sometimes, and for some more than others. But, if you keep in school, which it's part of our aim also in the program, and you take advantage of all these opportunities, that are presented to you, have hope, because, there's, we want kids to thrive. And I'd be interested in hearing more later, connecting even later, Justin, because one of for the pandemic, we asked students what kind of activities they wanted us to create online. And one of the main things they asked was to have Minecraft clubs. And we hesitated because I never played. And someone mentioned to me, no, you don't want to get involved with gaming because it can promote violence. And a lot of the parents are not going to be, in favor of this. But now that after hearing you, I'm very curious and I'm interested in learning more about it, because that's the first thing that students asked us to. And since we're still taking advantage of all these online connectivity, we're hoping to create one with your help. Thank you.
Andreas asked me to convey his apologies to everyone, and he has had to drop off the call slightly before we finish, but we have another 30 minutes to continue the conversation, and there's some fantastic questions and comments coming in on the chat, which we're going to turn to in just a second. But I would love to kind of stick with that idea of hope, Maritza, that you were talking about, and think about how that resonates across Alia and Justin's work. I think, Maritza, when we first spoke, you talked about hope as a skill which needs to be developed and cultivated, I think. And I really love that idea. We've talked in some of our work at Salzburg Global about the moral responsibility towards hope, particularly when you're working with young people and you're talking about things like the climate crisis, which has been a theme in a number of the discussion so far this evening, that you have to believe that it is something that can be addressed. Otherwise, you're doing a really significant disservice to young people. So I'd love to talk a bit more about hope, and also about role modeling that you talked about as well, and the importance of positive role models for young people. So I mean, Alia, with your work, and when you're challenging dominant media narratives, or you're looking at some of the young artists that you've been working with, where does hope fit into that portfolio? And is it something that you talk about explicitly in your when you're beginning to work with them? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it's as Maritza was saying, it's really central to our work, because we are constantly encountering and speaking about and addressing and sitting with and immersing ourselves in very serious, upsetting realities of the world, whether it's climate collapse, whether it's social injustice, whether it's global inequality. These are the themes that we are working with. With Shubbak, also, I want to add also that we're talking about a community of people who are being constantly misrepresented, not just on the news, but through the films we see, the TV series. I mean, there's been improvements, but it's a single narrative that you hear about this part of the world, and the self-fulfilling prophecy that can come out of that. I'm not saying everyone's going to become a terrorist, of course not. But what we're saying is that these young people, and anyone, starts to have very self-limiting beliefs. And this is very problematic in the sense of, how are we going to ask young people to be agents of change and to take on the incredible burden that they're inheriting from generations that have been reckless before them, without also equipping them with, and I love that, Maritza, the skill of hope. I love that as a skill, because it's a way of exercising. I mean, when we look at neuro-linguistic programming and we look at neuroscience, we know that we can wire our brains to become more positive. We know that. And going back to Justin's point on mindfulness, and kind of being able to exercise your brain as you would exercise a muscle in your body. So absolutely drilling and using language and role modeling this positivity, this hopefulness, and always framing. So always beginning with hope and ending with hope, because the messy middle is very hard to hold together. And so it has to be framed at either end with very positive messaging and solution-driven ideas as well. And so I'm also very interested in Justin's work around mindfulness, you know, and how we can build that muscle for ourselves through, whether it's through gaming or otherwise. I mean, this is fantastic if you can become, you know, more mindful and build that kind of positive capacity through gaming. It's fantastic. I'll be your guinea pig, Justin, if you ever need one for these kinds of things.
That sort of the kind of the muscle analogy, or the developing it, is really interesting because of the, you know, and this connects to a question that Catherine Miller did put in the chat about how do you help students recognize their achievement, help young people recognize their achievements with this. And, you know, Minecraft is an interesting example perhaps to start with here, because you've got, I think there's kind of rewards or levels or recognition built in to it. So it would be interesting to hear, Justin, about the role that plays in kind of motivation and incentivizing, and then Alia and Maritza, to come back to you and think, how do you help students, how did Catherine put it, you know, present their accomplishments in this area, in this arena. So, you know, it's not like having an A-level or a baccalaureate. How do you create the recognition for being good, mindful practitioners, or displaying great empathy, or showing great resilience? But Justin, if we could start with you, please.
Yeah, I think that Andreas talked earlier about, you know, changing assessment and changing the way that we approach assessment in this field. And I think gaming has some interesting options to offer. I recently was working, looking at a game from the Netherlands, which is again built, it was kind of built out of Minecraft, which was a time-based game to, the waters were rising, and it was a kind of flood prevention game. But the activities that learners undertook inside that game were measurement of different skills. So negotiation, communication were involved very early on in the game. But also teamwork and collaboration to solve some of the problems in different parts of the game. And then problem solving came into that. And by looking at we call it path tracing. So as you move around inside a game, you create a path of your actions. By looking at that data, you can actually look at quite a granular level around what learners are doing and how they're doing things. And from that basis, you can get both formative and summative assessments. So you can have formative feedback during the game, where characters within the game are just asking the question, are you sure you want to do that? And getting the learner to reflect on that point. And then summative, and in this case, actually producing a grid of data which showed your performance against individual skills attributes. So the learner's getting very constructive feedback. And the great thing is that with that game, they can repeat the game again. So immediate learning can be applied. They can look at kind of skills deficits and skills strengths and go back into the game and try and rerun the game. And this type of approach is, yes, coming into the education space, but actually it's finding a lot of foot in the professional space. So where we see things like healthcare workers who also need this feedback on this immediacy. And again, in an environment where there is a freedom to fail, where actually the reward is the conversation, not about just what skills you have, but how you address the skills gaps and how you build kind of skills up in terms of the skills that we're talking about here. So gameplay does have that. And just to pick up on that, I did mention on the early one around hope. I think the other thing that we've discovered is hope is a very important part, but actually allowing learners to have a cause and being able to act upon that cause in democratic means, but understanding a cause that they can take forward has been quite an interesting area of gameplay that we've been exploring recently.
I think it's really, really important, isn't it? The kind of, we started with this in some ways, didn't we, about the importance of social purpose or, whether that's a cause in the relationship with, the hope and, the belief that you have to be able to address these societal or environmental or economic or whatever challenge it is. I think, Maritza, your work is in a kind of amazing valediction of that, isn't it? I think because, it started and it takes place against this backdrop of, levels of violence in society. And yet there's, so much positivity within it. So, when you're working with the after school clubs, is part of the focus on designing community projects that give a sense of purpose and the opportunity for active citizenship and positive change?
Yes, we have a few of the clubs that are specifically designed to do that. We have a leadership club, where students have to, identify a problem or an issue at school or in their communities, and they'll have to come up with different solutions on how to solve it. And then it's a full year process. And then towards the end of the year, there's this competition, where they have to present the issue and then the solution to a panel, which includes the principal of the schools, we call leaders from the community, we call parents and students, and they all have to, vote on a few of these initiatives. And we're able to provide some of the funding to make these initiatives happen. But what happens a lot of the times, and I really miss that, I really miss this about being in the schools and having these interactions with all these people from the communities. A lot of the times the mayor will show up to these presentations and maybe one of the initiatives wins the competition, but then the mayor will say, I love all the competitions, so from the municipal funds, I'm gonna also fund, the second and the third initiative. So that happens a lot, or even the community itself, right? Say like, maybe we can gather some community resources or people volunteer to make it happen, and without having necessarily to look for funding. And going before, you were talking about the issue of competition, and I know Andreas mentioned it in the presentation, and it really is really making me think, because that was an internal debate for us the whole time, because our teachers, and I don't know what it's like in Europe, but here in El Salvador, and a lot of the countries that we work, there's this feeling that, competition, it's not a pro-social, skill, that we want to promote, that it's more individualistic, that it comes from the West and blah, blah. So, but we were trying to get kids to showcase everything they've learned, because I think, like you said, it's important for them. Like, I've been working very hard at, learning debate skills. I want to go to a debate tournament and be able to show off what I've learned. And it's amazing how, when we started doing all these competitions in the middle of the year and at the end of the year, participation in the clubs just went up like crazy. Kids became more engaged, and wanting to learn. They were more present in during the club sessions because they really wanted to learn. And I think a lot of it just has to do with, the kind of support, and the language also that we talk about. Kids get frustrated when they lose, and how us as adults, we create these safe spaces where we talk about, failing and how we can learn from these failures and be able to do better the next year. And I think that's something that I've seen happening the more years we've been working with one specific schools, how the newer schools initially have a really hard time at adjusting to failure. But as time progresses and the more familiarized also they become with the other students, which goes back to also our intent, our goal of reducing violence, that, in a soccer game, if you get hit by another student, but you don't have a relationship with this student, it's the first time you're meeting this other person, there's very likeliness to there be some confrontation, like, hey, why did you hit me? And then there's this pushover that happens, and we would always be like, hey, wait, we're playing. But we started being more intentional, and before the game, have like a circle and do some interactions with the students in the middle of the game. Also have them play with different teams, so they just would know the other students before the actual tournament. And so when the actual tournament happened and students bump into each other, you know, it's like, oh, no problem, like it's okay, you know, there's no escalating of conflict happening. And so I think it's competition. It's a great motivation. We've stick with those for the past years and we continue to do them, but I think it's very important for adults and for everyone that it's involved in designing these programs. I'm sure, Justin, probably you also, when you look at these questions that pop into the games, that's part of the process, right? How do we make them reflect and act upon those reflections?
Can I jump in here as well? Because Maritza, you're raising such an important point around social and emotional learning and how we enter spaces and kind of setting up spaces, what Brené Brown calls container building, so that we are getting the most out of each other. And this notion of these safe spaces being very brave, and that's a very emotional and social skill, bravery and courage. So this idea that when you enter a space, especially when we're talking, because we talk quite a bit about racial justice, we entering a space, how do you build spaces where we're all on a learning journey, all of us, but every single one of us is on a learning journey. We're part of a system that has taught us things that we've internalized, misinformation. So taught us misinformation that we've all internalized. We're at different places of the learning journey. How do we make space for each other to keep learning together in the knowledge that we might offend each other, we might hurt each other? As you said, someone might push the other, because these kinds of spaces where we make space for mistakes to happen, because in the process of learning, as Justin said, something that we are missing is the ability to fail and the way we punish each other when we fail, because we've been punished when we failed. So how do we break that cycle? That's also social and emotional, isn't it? It's very emotional, that process of unlearning all the misinformation that we have been fed all our lives, and making space for each other to offload the misinformation that we've been learning. And so that setting up of these spaces as a social and emotional exercise that permits expansive learning as a result is just, it's like we can't give it enough importance.
I completely agree with that. I think Reg Braggs in the chat has added a kind of interesting additional point to that about the value of competition and competition happening within safe spaces, as you characterized it, Alia, so that it helps young people learn how to be good winners as well as good losers. We're almost at the end of our time together. So what I would love to do by way of asking you for kind of closing or final remarks is, we've got people joining from many different countries around the world in the audience, and there'll be many more watching the on-demand, watching the recording of this later this week and next week. So it would be fantastic to get a couple, if each of you could share one or two key recommendations from all of your vast experience designing programs that explicitly or intentionally or otherwise do help young people develop their social and emotional skills. For people who are thinking about what more they can do to help young people who they work with in their communities develop these kinds of skills, for all the reasons that Michael Nettles talked about at the beginning and that Andreas has talked about throughout the presentation. What would be your one or two key recommendations to consider when people are starting to design programs that will help with the development of social and emotional skills? Alia, would you mind?
Yes.
Put you on the spot and ask you to go first.
No, absolutely.
Justin, and then Maritza.
Thanks, Dominic, for that very important question. So something that we've increasingly started to emphasize is the inner work. And that's about social and emotional learning, isn't it? So really working with young people and anyone we work with and ourselves, the kind of humility that it requires to go into yourself and go, where am I at? What are my values? What fuels me? what drives me, what gives me purpose, you know? So we literally lay out a values map and do the inner work so that the work is coming from the inside out and is not a tick box exercise. So it's all our work is based on first sitting with yourself, feeling with yourself, not just thinking about yourself, but feeling, really placing the heart at the center of the work and then moving forward from there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alia. Justin.
I think I go back to my earlier point, we have to create a safe space and learn to fail. So we have to create a safe space for failure and learn to fail. You don't need computer games to do that. You can do that in any educational setting, because, you know, if we don't learn to fail, we fail to learn. Failure allows us to dig deep on questions and understanding and knowledge and skills and abilities. And it requires a lot of careful and detailed thought, and challenging subjects require you to go deep on how do we expose our failure of understanding, our failure of knowledge, our failure of ability to apply. But that effort is well spent when you see learners coming out the other end of it with a new, stronger, better understanding. And that applies very much to social and emotional learning, understanding our emotions and understanding how we interact, relate, behave, and reach other people is crucial to success in the future of society.
Brilliant. Thank you, Justin. Maritza.
Yes, I want to say two things. First is to really listen to your community, or, you know, and specifically the work that we do with students and youth is really making very intentional, creating these opportunities for them to, you know, express what is it that they're interested in. If you tailor to their interests, you know, as we can see from the panel, I mean, there's so many different ways that we can teach social emotional learning, and we can take advantage of whatever interests they have, whether it's, you know, games, computer games, or soccer, arts, science, whatever it is. But you really have to listen in and tune in with what their needs are, and then what their interests, so that you can take that into account. And then second, I would say also don't forget about yourselves. Kind of echoing what Alia was saying about, you know, the innate work. We as adults, we have to remember that students learn from adults, right? We model behavior, and we can't demand of them to put into practice this social emotional learning skills if we ourselves are not putting them into practice as educators, as parents, as program staff. You know, I know it's hard, and times are certainly more stressful now and difficult, and it's okay to show that vulnerability to students. Like, you know, I'm very expressful with my face, so they can really tell when I'm upset, and I just say it straight out in the moment, like, I'm having a really tough day today. So, you know, and you know, that the empathy comes out all the time. So I think it's that, like, really listening into the students' voice, the community, the needs of the community, and then don't forget about your own needs, and attention for you, your staff, to be able to not only take care of yourself, but also be coherent, you know, with the demands that we ask of students.
It's amazing, Maritza. Thank you all so much to the, you know, the three of you, and to Andreas for everything that you've shared. It now gives me enormous pleasure to hand over to a good friend and colleague, Carine Allaf, who's a Senior Programs Advisor at Qatar Foundation International, and is going to close us out today. So Carine, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Alia, Justin, Maritza, Andreas, and Dominic, for such a lively and engrossing discussion. And thanks so much to everyone who contributed comments and questions. It was a lively chat happening in the chat window. So Qatar Foundation International is an educational organization committed to advancing Arabic language teaching and learning. QFI supports innovative research-based Arabic language programs in state-funded primary and secondary schools, and works to increase access to Arabic instruction for educators and students around the world. We currently support programming in Canada, Germany, Ireland, Qatar, across the United Kingdom and the United States. We're also based in Washington, DC in the United States. So QFI believes that language learning, be it learning a new language or learning your own mother tongue, go hand in hand with social and emotional learning. To be multilingual, you're learning about a new part of the world via a new language. This cross-cultural experience not only builds empathy, but is really centered on social and self-awareness, key social and emotional skills, and something we talked a lot about today, that connection with others. And when you're learning your own mother tongue, social emotional learning allows those students to be less anxious and have more self-esteem and motivation as they are building their home language skills, especially if they're living in countries where the home language is not the same as the host language. So like ETS, we were one of the very first organizations to support Karanga, the Global Alliance for Social Emotional Learning and Life Skills. And we're extremely excited to see how big the alliance has gotten and how wide the reach has gone. Today's program was the second that looked at this topic. In the earlier program that happened earlier, depending on where you are in the time zones, earlier today, Dominic and Andreas were joined by Laura, president of the Andrea Bocelli Foundation in Italy, Karima, co-founder and executive president of Temkin Community Foundation for Human Development in Morocco, and Marco, managing director of Fund Life in the Philippines. So in different ways, all of these programs are about building communities, about developing co-agency and mutual support, and about developing your own identity and not just living with the identity that other people put on you. So for those who are interested in the recording from this morning's session, as well as from the session that we just had today, and a copy of Andreas' presentation, they should all be on the Salzburg Global website shortly. So this idea of learning as fundamentally a relational rather than transactional experience has been at the heart of much of QFI's work. QFI runs many exchanges, both in person and virtually, especially in today's COVID age. These are excellent examples of how students make meanings of their own identities in various topics, such as learning Arabic or about the Arab world, or even about hydroponic gardens, how they operate in Doha versus in Brooklyn, New York. They do this by working collaboratively and cross-culturally. Students are able to make meaning about various topics that they are studying about by working with someone from a different part of the world. At QFI, we have seen this impact both with students interacting with others in Qatar, but even with exchanges from students who just come from a different city in their own country, like here in the United States. Another example of this relational nature of learning for QFI comes from the study of adolescent lives after migration to America, what we call Salama. Salama is a study we fund that's being implemented by Washington University in St. Louis that focuses on the adjustment and well-being of newcomers resettled to the United States from Arabic-speaking countries. Sites so far have included Detroit, Michigan, Harrisonburg, Virginia, and Austin, Texas. It's clear that SEL initiatives in schools, whether it's in classrooms or in the actions of their educators or in the school system as a whole, all present invaluable opportunities for promoting student adjustment, including among newcomers in the school more broadly. So by centering social and self-awareness and promoting healthy relationships, SEL can help avert some of the more painful stressors of adjustment, such as bullying. Students really appreciated efforts to learn about and adjust to them, especially in contrast to other experiences with educators, like those where they've been maybe scolded for speaking Arabic, for example. The adolescent student in our study felt seen when educators demonstrated knowledge about their country of origin and were grateful for accommodations such as homework extensions during Ramadan. So we've been proud to partner with ETS, Microsoft, and Salzburg Global Seminar on the Education for Tomorrow's World series over the last 4 years and are excited about potential future collaboration. In conclusion, I really want to thank Andreas Schleicher for his presentation and giving so much of his time today with these two programs, to Alia Alzougbi, with whom QFI has had a long and fruitful partnership, to Justin Edwards from Minecraft, at our friends and partners at Microsoft, and to Maritza Trejo from the Glasswing International. I really enjoyed learning about your work today. I'd also like to thank our partners at ETS, Michael and Catherine. Michael, thank you for your opening remarks. And at Microsoft and the Salzburg Global Seminar team, particularly Karina Navatsky and Faye Hobson, and of course, Dominic. And most of all, thank you to all of you for your questions and sharing your time with us today. We hope to see you all again at our next online Education for Tomorrow's World event. Thank you.